Hey Meissner Makers, it is Wednesday, it is 1 o'clock, it is time for our Workshop Wednesday. So glad that you're here and able to join us today. If you are a regular follower, then what we're doing this week is following along with the next steps in our Garden Path Quilt. If you are not a regular attendee, stick with us. What we're going to be talking about today are some ways to do some very simple strip piecing and cutting, and we're going to talk a little bit about raw edge blanket stitch applique. Following today's session, if you're jumping in for the first time, you may want to go back to the Garden Path 1, where we talk about cutting out the quilt from the quilt pattern, how to attach the first round of borders around the center printed panel. So that's going to be some good information for you, because not only does it set you up for success in stitching the borders around the center panel of the quilt, but that's the same technique that you will use and the same tips that you will use anytime that you are putting a border on a quilt. And then it's also going to be the information that you'll follow to put the very last narrow border around this quilt once you get the quilt top completed. So today, again, we're going to talk about some strip piecing, and we're going to talk about blanket stitch applique. Are you ready, cameraman Joel?
Yeah, let's get started.
All right. So if we take a look at our pattern, what we're going to be putting together are the borders, the pieced border strips that come around our center medallion. The instructions tell us that we're going to piece the right and the left hand side strips first. Now in your cutting, you will have cut the tiny little ladybug elements that you see here. As you're cutting these out, just keep an eye, they don't all face in the same direction. So when you're thinking about strip piecing these outer borders, you want to make sure that you take into account which direction the ladybugs are facing. There's no right or wrong, but you may want to carefully plan these out if you are a little bit more of a conservative quilter versus an anything goes quilter. So let's take a look first at the strips. Your instructions are going to tell you how wide to cut the light teal, how wide to cut the dark teal, and how wide to cut the white strips, and how many of each strip. So the first thing that you'll do is take the teal and white strips, join them together, and then I like to press my seam allowances towards the dark side if there's no reason for me to press them in any other direction. So I chose to strip piece all of my teal and whites together and press all of my seam allowances toward the dark side of the fabric. Your next step is going to be to take these strips, and then you're going to cross cut according to the width indicated in your instruction sheet. Now, the one thing that I would share with you as a tip, when you are cross-cutting strips that have been pieced together, you will want to square off the outer edge, and every once in a while as you're going down through the strip and you're continuing to cross-cut, you may need to re-straighten that edge. It can get a little wonky over time. I like to put the solid line or a line on the seam allowance itself. You can square off anything else that you need to, but you can't square where that seam allowance is. So if I were cutting, let's say a 3-inch cross cut, I want to make sure that my outer edge is perfectly straight, and I want to make sure that my seam allowance is straight and following one of the marking lines on my ruler. And then I'm ready to cross cut my fabric. Scoot it out of the way. Oh, might be time for a new blade. Scoot it out of the way. Then bring my ruler back, make sure that this is nice and straight, make sure the seam is nice and straight, and cut. And then continue down for however many cross-cut pieces I need according to the instructions. Now, once I have those pieces cut, and I have a selection of the dark teal and a selection of the light teal, the instruction sheets are going to tell me to create some 4-patch blocks. And we're going to do that by turning so that we have the teals opposite each other. Now remember, we press to the dark side each time. When we get ready to sew this together and we place them right sides together, those seam allowances are going in opposite directions. So they're going to butt right up against each other to give me a nice, tight, clean stitch and corner. So that once they're sewn together, we have a nice intersection where everything is matching. Okay, so that's part of the reason for, in this case, pressing dark to dark. If I were sewing on fabrics that perhaps were not so, didn't have so much visual contrast, the direction that I want to press is so that the seams are going to be going in opposite directions when I pair them up with the next group of fabric that they're going to, or the next unit that they'll be sewn to. I always want those seam allowances going in opposite directions to get those nice crisp points. So once you've done all your 4x4s, you're going to join the segments, again, according to the diagram or according to the instruction sheet. So if I were sewing across this top edge, this unit needs one more section added so that I have 3 dark teals and 2 light teals before I join my ladybug. Okay, so do make sure you're following along according to the instruction sheet so that all of your lights end up on the inside and all of your darker teals end up on the outside. So again, we'll have all of our units put together. See, I think we have the proper number here. Yep. Light teals go on the inside. Our ladybug flew away. Our ladybug goes in the center. And then our remaining strip is joined to the ladybug so that we have a nice long section that we would then attach, in this case, to the top of the quilt. So you'll want to do the 2 sides first, side 1, side 2, and then create the strips for the top and the bottom. But before we sew the top or the bottom final border in place, we are going to create our ladybug appliques. To create the cornerstones of our quilt, it does call for some traditional applique. Now, I have forgotten how much I enjoy blanket stitch applique. We do so much with embroidery. But if you don't yet have an embroidery machine, you will find that in your pattern, it does include the templates to create the little ladybug applique. You definitely want to create these appliques before you stitch these pieces to the top and the border pieced segments. So you're going to start very simply by cutting a square of the background fabric according to the pattern instructions. From there, we're going to use Steam-A-Seam 2. Now, I recommend Steam-A-Seam 2 for this because I can remove the paper from either side. 2 of your ladybugs are going to face the way that's shown on the pattern, and then 2 of them need to be mirror imaged. With the Steam-A-Seam 2, I can see through this, and I can see through it really well with my light box. I can trace my pattern pieces. I don't have to worry about flipping over the pattern for the mirror image shapes. So here I have 2 of my ladybug segments cut. I'm going to mark an X on this side of the paper. Then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to mark X's on the other side for the 2 that are mirror imaged. I know this sounds confusing. So when I remove the paper, we're going to walk through it. I'll remove this side for one set of ladybugs. I will remove the other side for the second set of ladybugs so that I end up with ladybugs pointing to the right and ladybugs pointing to the left without having to worry about doing an actual mirror image of the pattern. So let's show you how that works. Okay, so again, we're going to use our light box. We're going to put our Steam-A-Seam over the top. Imagine that this is a writing instrument. And I'm going to trace my ladybug shapes. Okay, the head, and trace the body. Trace, trace, trace. I'm going to do this twice I like to do a right and a left and then a right and a left. That way I don't get confused as to where I am and which direction my ladybugs need to go. Now, once I have my shapes drawn out on the paper, I will then come through and cut them. So let's start with just the bodies themselves first. And yes, I'm using my sewing scissors to cut my Steam-A-Seam too. Nothing awful is going to happen. Okay. Now remember that I made an X on one head and one body on this side of the Steam-A-Seam and an X on the opposing side of the Steam-A-Seam. That's how I'm going to keep track of which ladybug body is going in which direction. Okay. I like working with Steam-A-Seam too because number one, I can see through to be able to utilize both sides for this type of a process. But also when I remove the paper backing, it does have a little bit of sticky to it, so it will hold in place on my fabric. So I'm going to remove the sides of the Steam-A-Seam that have the X's because one went on the top side of the Steam-A-Seam, one went on the underside of the Steam-A-Seam. I have mirror imaged without having to think about it. Let's see, do I have enough space on this particular fabric? Okay, Steam-A-Seam 2 is slightly sticky on both sides. Removing the side with the X, which now gives me a mirror image shape of the first one. Now, if you are working with another fusible webbing that only gives you the option of easily being able to remove one side or the other, you can still use that particular web, but you will need to remember to mirror image your shapes. And let's go this way. So this piece of fabric is just a hair snug. There we go. All right, so we now have our fusible web in place on our fabric, and we're going to cut out our shapes. Now you're going to be tidier about this in the privacy of your own sewing environment, but for you to be able to see where we're going. Okay, now we're ready to place the ladybug body down on our background fabric. So here you see that we have actually created, by flipping that Steam-A-Seam over, we've created this body. The other one will create the mirror image. Now I'm going to remove the Steam-A-Seam paper. And position this in place. Now for the ladybug's head, I would suggest that you have your pattern on the light box so that when you're ready to position the head, you can see exactly where it goes, and then all 4 ladybugs will be the same. The other thing that I like to do is draw in the little antennas so that I can follow those stitching lines when I am at the machine and I'm ready to sew the little antennas in place. Okay. Once you have all of your pieces lined up on your background fabric, we're ready to go to the machine and stitch our blanket stitch around the raw edge. Now, something that I neglected to mention, this is a raw edge applique technique. A blanket stitch is going to secure your applique shapes in place, but it's not the same type of a permanent hold as you would have with a satin stitch. It's not sealing the fabric all the way around. With Steam-A-Seam 2, that is going to seal your fabric edges, so you don't have to worry that this is going to ravel out over time. For this particular ladybug, I did take a little creative license and add a little decorative stitch here at the top or the end of each of his little antennas. I found the best way to do this was to start at the ladybug's head, straight stitch up and around until I came to where I wanted it to end, and then stitch just one pass of a decorative stitch. If you choose to do this, I would start with a little scrap piece of fabric first, just so that you can test out and see what stitches are going to work well, and so that you know where do they start. Does the decorative stitch start in the middle of the element? Okay, that way you won't be disappointed or have to do any unstitching. So again, we're going to start with a straight stitch, and we used our light box to trace where that antenna lives. It's not necessary to trace where the antenna lives, but you may want to, if for no other reason at all, is to kind of know where you're going. Okay, right now we are threaded with white thread, which is not going to be particularly beautiful or visible for our antenna. All right, so we have red thread in our machine now so that you'll be able to see where we're going. I'm not recommending that you stitch out the antennas with red thread, but I want you to be able to have a good visual for what we're doing, and also for our blanket stitch as we go around the head of the ladybug, again, so that you can see what's happening with the stitch formation. So I'm going to use just a regular old straight stitch. There's no wrong way to do this. It's totally up to your personal preference. Now, if your machine happens to have any kind of a pivoting feature or function, this is a great place to use it so that you can follow right along that curve easily. See how that foot just lifts up just that tiny bit so that I can work my way right around the antenna shape. Now you could also choose to do the antennas as part of the quilting when you get ready to free motion quilt your finished piece. Now at this point, if I were going to add a decorative stitch, this is where I would add it. If you're choosing not to do that, I'm going to go ahead and tie off, cut my thread, come back to the other antenna, and repeat the process. Now when you are ready to start blanket stitching around the applique shapes, a blanket stitch typically dances forward, takes a bite in, out, forward, right, left, forward, right, left, forward. That straight part, or that forward, is what needs to ride right along the raw edge or the cut edge of your applique shape. Those little bites out to the right are what create the blanket effect coming down and around your applique shape. Whenever you're doing blanket stitch applique, you always want to pivot while the stitch is in the straight part of the sequence, or while the needle is off to the left. If you pivot while the needle is in the bite, you're going to end up with little V's in your blanket stitches instead of E's in your blanket stitch. Okay? If you do this incorrectly, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about with those V's and E's. So we're going to choose a blanket stitch. Now, if your machine gives you the option of adjusting stitch length and stitch width, on a blanket stitch, what that means when you adjust the stitch length is you are getting the straight part of the stitch further and further apart, which means you will have fewer of those little bites or those little E's swinging out to the right-hand side. So it gives you some options for adjusting that stitch so that it's exactly what you want. So let's run just a little bit of a blanket stitch here. Oh, a little bit more so you'll really be able to see this. Okay, so as the machine is traveling forward, it's creating this straight part of the stitch. So it comes forward, swings, comes forward, swings, comes forward, swings. Those swings are what are securing the applique fabric to the background fabric. If you pivot while the needle is out here in the swing, when your needle comes back, it's going to form a little V out of that stitch instead of a straight line out of that stitch. So the pivot always needs to happen when your needle is on the left. Now I can adjust my stitch length, and let's just really make this long. And by adjusting my stitch length, it's going to put those little swings out to the right further and further away from each other. Okay, do you see how much further they are apart now that we've adjusted our stitch length? We can also choose to adjust our stitch width. If you're looking for something that looks a little more like hand applique. Now, done with a heavy thread, this is going to give the look of like a wool embroidery type blanket stitch. So do you see how much deeper now those swings out to the side are? And you can adjust length and width independently to get exactly the look that you're after for the project that you're working on. For my little ladybugs, I don't want that stitch to be particularly far apart, but I also don't want it to be particularly wide. It just needs to be enough to nip in and catch each of those applique shapes. There's no right or wrong for this. It's a matter of personal opinion. So I do want to start with my needle down, right next to what I would call the ditch of the applique shape. I want the straight part of the stitch to always end up just to the outside of the applique shape. And then I want that swing to just catch the applique. So we're going to use the red thread just so that we can see it maybe a little bit better. Anytime we're pivoting, remember that we're pivoting while the needle is to the left in the straight part of the stitch. In real life, you're going to use a thread color that coordinates with the applique shape that you're stitching. Unless there's a decorative reason why you might want to go with a contrast. Now, a gray thread might be kind of fun along the outside edge of the ladybug's head. The more that thread shows on an applique project like that, the more of a primitive look you'll get to your stitching. And again, no right or wrong. It's completely a matter of personal preference. All right. So I'm going to stop this here. In real life, you're going to go all the way around the ladybug's head before you stop. But for the sake of demonstration, I think we have enough in here for you to be able to see straight stitch, swing, straight stitch, swing, straight stitch, swing. Make sure that you're pivoting when you are on the outside edge of the applique. Okay, so for our final tips and hints for making the construction of this quilt top go quickly and easily. So we have our tips for those little border strips that we've sewn around the central panel. We walked through how to create the four-patch, how to that we need to pay attention to the direction of the ladybugs. Once you have your ladybug and your four-patch strips ready to go, remembering that the light teal goes to the inside, a hint for lining everything up. Now, if your sewing's been close to accurate and your cutting's been close to accurate, they should be close to accurate when you line up the side piece border to the center. What I like to do, because fabric is shifty and it does wiggle around, is when I'm ready to sew this strip to the other side of the quilt, I'll start by aligning the top and the bottom and clipping them in place. Now you could pin, but I really, really love these little binder clips. I don't have to worry about picking my fingers with them when I'm removing them as I come up to the pins when I'm stitching. And also sometimes with a pin you may not see it and then accidentally sew over it. And you really want to avoid sewing over pins. If at all possible, you can cause quite some damage to your machine. So this prevents that from happening and prevents me from getting picked fingers. So I do top and bottom, and then I would clip it in the center, and then you can kind of shift and wiggle the rest of the fabric if you need to, so that everything lines up the way that it's supposed to. So once you have both sides attached and you have stitched together your panels for the top and the bottom, they'll look like so. And then you will attach your completed applique ladybugs to each side, and at that point you're ready to attach the top and the bottom. Now, one thing I neglected to mention when we were sewing our ladybug bodies together, when we were doing the applique, I would put a little bit or a piece of tearaway stabilizer underneath this while you are stitching that blanket stitch. It's just going to help keep everything nice and crisp and flat for you. And then just gently tear it away when you're done. Okay, now once you have completed that round, the only thing left to do is sew that very last border around the quilt top. It's a little narrow border. Follow the same rules. Cut your right and your left, making sure that they are the actual size of the quilt itself. If you find that your quilt measure it on the right, measure the left, measure the center, take the average, and that's what you're going to cut those strips to. So the right and the left, measure the top, measure the center, measure the bottom, take the average. So cut and sew your top and your bottom border, and you are then ready to layer it up and to quilt as desired. Now, I know some of us really don't love that particular instruction, quilt as desired, but there is lots of great information out there on how to quilt the quilt, and it just isn't in the scope of time that we have for today's presentation. One more last little thing for those of you that are brand new quilters or piecers. I didn't talk about thread. Now, when I did the applique shapes, here they are, I wanted something that wasn't super shiny. I wanted more of a matte finish. I just wanted it to look like, almost a hand stitch type effect. This is simply 50 weight cotton sewing thread that I used. You could use embroidery thread. You could use something a little heavier. You could use something a little lighter. It really just depends on the look that you're after for your project. So this is 50 weight cotton Meissner construction thread, same type of thread that you may be using to construct your quilt. Now on a quilt top like this, where any of my blocks don't have a tremendous number of intersections, that 50 weight cotton is great. But I have to tell you that in general, I tend to use a 60 weight cotton thread, which is hiding under our quilt here, for my construction. It's a little lighter weight. If I have places where there are lots of seams that need to intersect and join, this thread is going to take up less space in my seams than a 50 weight thread. Plus it comes in a nice large size comb. That's the Meissner 60 weight. I would put it on a spool stand, a separate spool holder behind my machine. You don't need it in a tremendous number of colors. You need a couple of light neutrals and a couple of dark neutrals, and that'll really keep you going and get you well on your way to finishing up your quilt projects. So here's one last look at the quilt top completed. It still needs to be quilted, but lots of room for experimentation with your favorite quilting techniques. Very forgiving panel there in the center to practice following along lines, and lots of area to play with thread painting and different colors of threads and thread types. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you all are doing to finish up your Garden Path Quilt top. If you have any questions, suggestions, topics that you'd like to see covered on Workshop Wednesday, please send us an email at info@meissnersewing.com. We'll see you next week.